everyone. My name is Big Mike, and this is Attorney Sidney. And this is Venerable Injury Laws Podcast on that $1 million question. How do I get $1 million if I get into an accident too? Now, last segment, on the last segment we talked about a lot of advertisements that we see from the radio to the TV about attorneys claiming they get their clients millions of dollars, millions and millions of dollars on their accidents. And Sydney, you had mentioned that it's not that simple. Can we recap on what we talked about?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Last time I talked about how these attorney ads are comparing apples to oranges, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Your case is not as same as someone else's case. We all have unique fact patterns, different medical bills, different circumstances in which the accident affected you. And that's not even the end of how we calculate to get millions of dollars. The recovery is generally limited by the other person's insurance liability limits. So if the other person who drives the car, caused the accident, hits you,
Mm-hmm.
has $15,000 limit for their
Mm-hmm.
policy, which
Mm-hmm.
most of the people, I will say 80% of the people drives in Los Angeles carries, which is the minimum policy of the state of California.
Okay.
That means is that your maximum recovery, regardless of how bad the accident is, what the medical bills are, your pain and suffering is going to be limited to that $15,000 for that insurance policy.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. So you mean to say that if I'm driving down the boulevard and I get rear-ended and I broke my arm, I smashed my face against the windshield, the most I can get would only be what the policy limit was of the guy that hit me?
Exactly. So it still is not that simple, but I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
further explain in this episode how other elements of recovery plays into your total recovery. But as far as
Please.
insurance goes,
Okay.
on the other side, the other driver's insurance who caused the accident, the insurance is only going to pay up to the policy limit, which is, like I said, majority of the driver has a $15,000
Oh,
per
no, no,
accident.
no. I want that $1 million. Tell
Right.
me, how do I get
So
that $1 million?
it is true. I mean, we have recovered billions of dollars for our clients, who had serious accidents. And what I'm talking about today is not as to how serious your accident is or how bad you're injured, but what the potential avenue of recoveries are other
Okay.
than the other person's liability insurance.
Okay.
So, first case is where the other person basically was driving and had a personal auto insurance for $15,000 per person, but
Okay.
he or she wasn't driving, his or her own cars, borrowing someone else's car. Let's say
Mm-hmm.
borrowing their boss's car,
Okay.
and then caused the accident. Now,
Okay.
the vehicle owner's policy also carries a separate liability insurance. So
Mm-hmm.
whatever the limits of that liability insurance is will also kick in to pay for the damages that caused by the driver. And
Mm-hmm.
let's say if the driver only had a $15,000 and but the boss who let the driver borrow his or her car had $1 million of
Mm-hmm.
recovery or liability insurance limit. Now that $1 million is on the table. It doesn't guarantee just because that person has $1 million policy, you're gonna get
Mm-hmm.
million dollars from that insurance. You
Right.
have to
Right.
prove your damages are up to a million or exceeding, and that's the only way you're gonna get that policy tender. So that's
Oh.
one occasion. The other occasion,
Mm.
let's say you got into an accident and then the other person once again had only $15,000, but your medical bills, your pain and suffering, your lost wages are well over $15,000. One place you can look at is your own policy. If you carry something called underinsurance policy. So
Mm-hmm.
UM and UIM, that's an acronym for uninsured and underinsured. But this case, we're talking about underinsured because the other person had an insurance, but it's not enough.
Mm-hmm.
So under the UIM, under insurance policy, if the other person's policy is maxed out
Okay.
and wasn't enough to pay for your bills and pain and suffering, then you could look to your own policy coverage called underinsured policy, and we
Okay.
could basically claim that access damages to your own insurance policy. And let's say, and then these all have limits too. I
Yeah.
carry
Yeah.
$150,000 in UIM, and let's say I got into an accident with a person who only carried 15,000, and then my damages, from the accident caused by the other driver was well over 200,000. So
Mm-hmm.
I am able to tap into, let's say, $15,000 of the other driver, and we max that out because they tender. And now
Okay.
I'm going to claim the rest of the damages, which is about $185,000 left,
Yeah.
with my own insurance under
Okay.
UIM coverage. But however, my coverage, like I said, let's say is only $150,000. Now, my insurance is not going to pay me $150,000 or $185,000.
Yeah.
My insurance is only going to pay the offsetting amount from the $150,000 minus what the other person's insurance policy was, which was 15. So we are
Okay.
left at $135,000 potential recovery from my own UIM. Since
Mm.
my recovery, or since my damages were exceeding that amount, now I could further claim with my own insurance to get that policy tendered of the $135,000.
I
And that's
see.
scenario number two. We have
Okay.
another scenario where the other person had an umbrella coverage. And this is a term that we may hear once in a while, but we don't really know what that means.
Yeah.
Umbrella
Yeah.
coverage is a top cover coverage that covers any kind of a liability potential that you may incur in your life, basically. Let's
Mm-hmm.
say you had a homeowner's policy, you had a auto policy, you had other liability policies that may come into play in your life, but
Mm-hmm.
you felt that these policies had policy limits that's inadequate to cover your potential exposure, and you
Mm-hmm.
could you could further buy additional policy called the umbrella that covers a top cover, which means that after your policy limits on particular policy like auto policy is exhausted, let's say I carry a $30,000 policy limits on liability coverage, but I caused the accident that's well over $30,000. Now, if I
Mm.
had an umbrella policy that's over 30,000, let's say I had $100,000 umbrella policy. Now, I have a total of 30,000 plus $100,000, $130,000 in total to cover for damages that I caused for that
Mm-hmm.
particular accident. So the other driver may carry an umbrella policy, and this is a thing that you won't find out unless you really do some digging, or your attorneys. Hopefully,
Yeah.
they know what they're doing. We always check for umbrella policy. We ask for excess policy other than auto insurance that may come into play to pay for the damages in case the auto policy wasn't sufficient to cover the damages of our client.
I see.
Once in a while, we notice there's an umbrella policy that actually comes into play, and then we get to tap into that as well. And that may be $1 million, that may be $2 million. Is potentially very possible because umbrella policy generally have high limits.
I see. Okay.
And last situation that I can think of now is if that person was driving
Mm-hmm.
for work, in the
Mm-hmm.
course of employment. Now, employment is defined, legally. There is a specific definition, but let's just say, for our general understanding, like our first example, that driver who was borrowing the boss's car, could borrow the boss's car, on off clock because the boss was nice enough to, lend them a car. Or let's say that person was making a delivery for his job. Then,
Mm-hmm.
even if that person only carried a minimum policy under personal insurance, personal auto
Mm-hmm.
insurance, now the commercial policy that covers anything to do with driving in the course of employment for all employees for that company may kick in to cover for the damages that the employee has caused while he or she was on the clock driving the vehicle. And the
Oh,
commercial policy
okay.
generally carry a high limit.
Mm, mhm.
The lowest limit I've seen in commercial policy is probably $500,000. Generally, it's $1 million nowadays, if not more. If the delivery is part of the business, that business actually operates out of, they have to make constant delivery. Then
Okay.
they'll carry fleet policy that covers 2 million, 10 million, depending on how much driving exposure they see they have by operating their business and making deliveries all the time. So
Mm.
if the person who caused the accident carried a commercial policy, and that's a source of potential recovery that we could tap into other than that person's personal policy. And another unique thing that came about recently is people who drive for Uber and Lyft, these
Very
passenger
popular.
mobilities,
Very
passenger mobility
popular.
services.
Yeah.
And these now, because the laws were very hazy for a while,
Hmm.
people were trying to go after personal policy because they weren't technically employees and blah blah blah. But we have
Hmm.
codified these rules now. Uber and Lyft carry a umbrella policy or top cover policy on top of what generally these drivers have to sign up to drive for Uber and Lyft. So there are
Okay.
many multiple layers of policies in Uber and Lyft. So unless you had the knowledge to ask, Uber and Lyft is not going to voluntarily tell you, oh, we have this additional coverage,
Yeah.
so that you could tap into. So it's
Yeah.
always good to ask, your attorney, hey, if you know the other person was driving for Uber Lyft, did you ask Uber and Lyft for the additional coverage? And oftentimes, those are $1 million coverage.
Mm.
So, like I said, I mean, today I'm going to I'm only discussing the potential avenues of recovery. For you to get $1 million,
Hmm.
it's not enough that the other person has high limits. You have to prove your case is worth $1 million.
Hmm.
So, but these are the potential avenues of recovery and how these millions of dollars and settlements or judgments happen because the other person happened to carry multiple layers of accident, multiple layers of liability insurance, or they were driving for work or other circumstances.
You know what, Sydney? Talking to you and listening to you here, I realize that you really need a well experienced attorney on your case. Because I could imagine that there are a lot of attorneys out there that claim they are personal injury attorneys, where in fact they're involved in other areas of law, and I'm not really sure they know where to tap into in case that type of scenario happens. I'm pretty sure there might be even clients out there that believe that all they can get is a certain amount, and they've never even explored those other avenues that you mentioned today. So that's really really good to know when you're looking for an
Right, Mike. I
experienced
mean,
attorney.
yes, I think we need to kind of clarify that
Hmm.
just because attorney practices in other areas of law other than personal injury, it does
Yeah,
not mean they don't know personal injury.
yeah,
But
yeah.
experienced personal injury attorneys would know to look in right places to look for potential avenue of recovery, like I've
No.
described. And I just want to make sure that all these things we're talking
Hmm.
about,
Hmm.
is not the only way, you're going to get your million. There are other ways other than
Hmm.
potential recovery and more interesting topics such as popping policies. There are
Hmm.
occasions we could pop policies even if that person had a $15,000 policy. These huge judgments and recovery happens when insurance plays these games, not even to give you that
Hmm.
$15,000, and basically bites them in
Wow,
their
I'm
ass,
excited
to pay
to
for
listen to
millions
the
of dollars.
next one.
But that's for another time.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the information you shared with us today, Sydney. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure our followers appreciate very much too. And we want to thank our friends and family that follow us on our podcast. And we definitely look forward to seeing you guys on the next one. So thank you very much. Have a great day and drive safe. What if I can get $1 million too?
Wrap it
Okay.
up.
All right.